Welcome back. We're talking about the rising tide of populism in various countries around the world. Let's get back to our panel. Tian Wei, I just want to pick up where Daniel left us, and that was, we talked about a post-populist country. We have not seen that. We have not seen a post-populist country return to some kind of normalcy. Let's take Thailand, for example. The former Prime Minister, Thaksin Shinawatra, adopted, I guess, what could be described as populist policies, introducing a low-cost healthcare program for the country, as well as subsidies for farmers. Yet he was opposed by vested interests in the country. Would you say that those policies were successful? Because as we know, Shinawatra is no longer there.
Well, different countries have different circumstances when one policy or another was being churned out. I wouldn't comment specifically about exactly whether that is populist policy by Mr. Shinawatra. However, may I say this, that is the populist policies, or shall I say the rise of populism, we can still use that phrase, is a result of the blame game and the incapability of politicians to be able to look for a solution. Therefore, they would like to prefer to have a shortcut to seek political office and to satisfy what they believe as their constituencies. And of course, as a result of this kind of phenomenon, usually the populist policies are not necessarily the best policies for the country, particularly for the long term. Having said that, though, I think there is a difference between a political scandal and also populist policies. For example, at this moment in South Korea, one could also argue maybe there's a rise of populism against the establishment. However, one could also take a close look at it. That is one closely linked to a political scandal of the president right now in the Blue House. So the demands on the street by tens of thousands and the people is rather a rise of populism or their correct demand for the political leadership to be responsible for what they have been doing.
Well, Nathan, what do you think? I mean, the question posed there by Tian Wei, what is the point of populism? Is it to correct what many people see as a grave injustice perpetrated by the implementation of neoliberal policies?
I think in history there's always an action and a reaction, and I think we are at a stage at the moment where the post-Cold War and post-World War II architectures are not without their critics. They're showing signs of not being as dynamic as they once were. Look at the European Union, look at the IMF, look at the UN. There's people pulling out of the International Criminal Court. There seems to be a reaction against this sort of institutions. So there is that, but I also think it's a question of identity too. And we've had a Pax Americana for a long time. Europe also in control, and there is identity politics being played.
National identity. So, at what point does populism morph into nationalism?
I think the two are very linked. I mean, there is no accident that Donald Trump's key slogan was "Make America Great Again." His foreign policy is going to be America first. Brexit saw more flag-waving Union Jacks than I ever saw when I was growing up in the United Kingdom. They are linked. And I think it goes back to identity. And we haven't really talked about race a lot. It's a difficult subject here in the US and across, but there is a questioning by large segments of the white community across the developed world of where their place is in the pecking order. White men used to go to the office and earn enough money to provide for their whole family and were never questioned, and suddenly we're in a very different society indeed. In fact, it's not just economic angst in terms of white people, because if you break down who supported Donald Trump, for example, the average household income of a Donald Trump supporter, according to Pew Research, was $72,000, way higher than a Hillary Clinton supporter, and 44% of them have college degrees.
Right. Ambassador, the US President Obama, he talked about the rise of populism while he was in Greece. He's still in Europe right now. Let's listen to part of what he said.
People are less certain of their national identities or their place in the world. It starts looking different and disorienting. And there is no doubt that that has produced populist movements, both from the left and the right, in many countries in Europe.
Has the President got it right there, Ambassador?
Well, I think so. I think You know, the interesting thing is that this concern about national identity is expressed in places where there is immigration and places where there isn't immigration. And so in some cases, it's a theoretical concern about a threat to national identity. So in parts of in Europe, where there's the most anti-immigration sentiment, there's effectively no immigration whatsoever, that they're homogenous societies. So it is a global phenomenon, and it's fueled by fear and anxiety. I think principally economic anxiety and technological change, but sometimes confused with the idea that national identities within states are under threat.
Daniel, you talked earlier on at the beginning of the program about institutions in Latin America. To what extent is the rise of populist leaders, Cordillo as they called in Latin America, driven by weak institutions?
Well, I think that's there's definitely a cyclical nature. Most of the countries that are most prone, or many of the countries that are most prone to populist movements, are also the countries that tend to have very young constitutions in which the institutions themselves have not yet begun to be able to assert themselves, and they end up being very weak. And I think that that's something that we're definitely seeing. At the same time, this conversation attaching on to one of the statements that was made just now, I believe by the ambassador, that we have, that there's certain types of identity politics that do come into play. And I think much more so than nationalism, because you do have certain populist movements which are actually global. For example, in Venezuela, and I keep coming back to it, but in some senses it's the one I know best because I have roots there. What we saw was a leader that promised not to bring Venezuela back to a golden age because there had never been a golden age. What he promised was to make Venezuela the spear point of a revolution that was going to sweep through Latin America. So sometimes you do have populism that's not necessarily exceptionalistic nationalistically, but is more regionally focused.
All right, Tian Wei, you want to say something?
I think the problem may not necessarily be 100% the rise of populism, but rather how politicians are taking advantage of some of the concerns people have and some of the social movements going on right now. For example, in the presidential election this time inside your country, in the United States, there seems to be a disbelief of the so-called political correctness. But one can also argue there is a fundamental lines of values and also beliefs by a country and by a people that is the very bottom line with which a country is being established on. So when the rhetorics are about let's dismantle everything that we have had, that things have been that people have been taking pride in, and let's establish a new society. When the new rules and new values are not there, I'm afraid the politicians are taking very much advantage of the rise of populism. But if there are correct channels in which the rise of populism can be going through and right policy can be designed, I think this is a beautiful wake-up call for the system to correct itself, and also for the politicians to know what they should be, what their responsibilities should be about. This sounds like a general argument that I make, but I think it should work in different kinds of society, of course, depending on the circumstances specifically.
Right, Ambassador, I want to get back to Europe for a moment. Germany has an election coming up. There is deep resentment in Germany against the status quo, driven, according to the Washington Post, by terrorist attacks, by Islamic radicals, and there's been a record wave of Middle Eastern migrants as well. The Post, in its article, says that this is testing the national will in Germany. Do you see major changes coming up in Germany?
Well, I think that Germany has responded with terrific leadership in dealing with the most serious refugee crisis since World War II, and in welcoming the large number of immigrants principally from the Middle East and principally from Syria that it has. And Chancellor Merkel has really stood up and taken a leadership role, not only in the EU, but globally on this issue. But of course, you know, as one of the colleagues on the panel said, you know, every action has a reaction, and there is while in Germany, I think there is still very broad support for what Chancellor Merkel has done, and also a recognition that this immigration can also be beneficial to German society and for the growth of the German economy, that there is also a fringe in Germany which is concerned about this, and while it is still a fringe, it's growing to a certain extent, and the German elections next year will be a test of Germany's approach of openness, embracing globalization, and accepting responsibility, sort of a historical responsibility and a responsibility as a leader of Europe to address the refugee crisis coming from the Middle East.
Nathan, one final thought. When we look at something like populism, is this a phenomenon that is cyclical? Or to put it another way, is the pendulum swinging the other way right now? Are we going to see a return to, say, what was there in the 60s, the social welfare state?
You're asking me in a year where Donald Trump's been elected US president to make predictions? Look, yes, you can see cyclical things in history. I mean, obviously, Daniel talked about the 1920s, the rise of populist parties then, severe recession, legacy from the First World War. What we haven't had here is actually what's really interesting is we've seen rising incomes. You know, for a long period, they've started to stagnate. But if you look at the middle class in Europe, if you look at the middle class in America, they've never had it so good. Everyone's, you know, got enough to eat. We saw incomes rise for the middle class here and working class by the best we've seen in 20 years. So it's very interesting that even though we had this big economic crisis in 2008, the institutions held. In a lot of ways, turn things around, yet we're still seeing this populism. Is it because no one's got any new ideas going forward? Is it because people just get bored? There is a lot of analysis about how Western society is too boring, and people want something to excite them. But what we are seeing, I think, is a rejection of people like Hillary Clinton, who have spent years becoming experts in their field, who have spent years developing the language of political triangulation where you can appear to satisfy several competing groups all at the same time. There is a rejection of the art of politics as we've known it in the last 20 or 30 years. Now, where that leads, I don't know.